and thank you so much for joining us this evening for our 2023 Community Health Education Series. My name is Ivania Covington, and I am the Community Partnership Coordinator for Faith-Based Partnerships and Senior Strategies here in the Social Responsibility Department at Baptist Health. So this month, we are discussing the keys to healthy aging. And we have a dynamic special guest speaker tonight who I will be introducing in just a moment. But of course, as always, we always go over our housekeeping items. We will have the introduction of our speaker in the Q&A, and then we will have some brief closing announcements. So as it relates to our housekeeping items, tonight's session, as always, is being recorded and will be made available to all of the registrants after tonight's session. Also, we are also record attendance for our webinars. So if you are attending as a group, if you would please type the total number of your group in the chat so that we can record that for our records. And lastly, please feel free to type your questions in the chat during the presentation, and they will be addressed during the Q&A segment of the webinar. So without further ado, I would like to introduce this very special guest speaker tonight, Dr. Allison Bartfield. Dr. Bartfield was appointed to as the Medical Director for Senior Strategy for the Senior Strategy Service Line for Baptist Physicians Partners, as well as the Medical Director for Age Well Senior Care and House Calls, two novel primary care programs within the Baptist network exclusively serving the needs of patients aged 65 and older. She also served as the interim System Vice President of Quality and Clinical Effectiveness from October 2022 to June 2023. In her 20-year tenure with Baptist Health, Dr. Bartfield founded the Beaches Hospitalist Team, as well as the Beaches Quality Management Committee. She also co-founded the Health Connections program at Baptist Health in 2013. This novel post-acute care program served to improve transitions of care for hospitalized frail patients, as well as reduce rehospitalization for these at-risk patients. This program became the present-day house calls program serving our senior population. Dr. Bartfield subsequently served as the lead physician for the Baptist South Hospitalist Team, as well as the medical director for Baptist Home Health. Dr. Bartfield spent the last 10 years working for the Patient Safety Institute and MagMutual Insurance, and served on the MagMutual Board of Directors for the last 3 years. Most recently, she served as the chair of both the Practice Performance Committee and the Department of Medicine at Baptist South, as well as the co-chair of the Sepsis Clinical Transformation Work Group. So as you see, we have a wealth of information here with us tonight in Dr. Allison Bartfield. And Dr. Bartfield, when you're ready, we can begin.
So thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I really relish the opportunity to talk about aging well, about staying healthy, and about what it means for all of us in the community to take care of ourselves and take care of our loved ones in improving the quality of our life. Next slide. People often ask me what my inspiration is, and this is my sweet father. So he just celebrated his 95th birthday, and as you can see, he's very active. He actually works part-time and plays in local quartets and dance bands. That's been his profession since he was 11 years old. And so not only do I take great joy and purpose in taking care of my patients in the community, but also in a very meaningful way, I'm right in it with everybody else in trying to take care of my own family. You know, it's funny, when I joined Baptist 21 years ago, I was a young physician, and I remember meeting a lot of colleagues who were somewhere around 50, about to turn 50, 50 something. And now I've had the privilege and the joy of working alongside of them for many years, and have seen many of the colleagues that were my mentors and the people that I looked up to now entering retirement and the next stage of their life. And so it's kind of funny. I think that all of us feel, I hope, younger than we are. Somebody Googled my name the other day and they said, you have 27 years experience. And I thought, no, that can't be me because that would make me middle-aged. But in fact, I am just like many of the participants, hopefully on this webinar, I'm approaching Medicare age and I'm trying very hard to practice what I preach and to educate not only myself, but my colleagues, my friends, my family, and the community about how we can live better. Next slide. So there's a new book out that is kind of ironic. Several of my physician colleague friends who are either recently retired or very passionate about staying healthy or taking care of seniors all have been talking about this book. And it was so important to me that it really framed a lot of what I wanted to speak about today. And so I wanted to share with you the title. This physician is actually very much my contemporary and started out his career as a oncology surgeon and has really spent the last decade or more investigating why we age, and how we can all live better. Because nobody wants to grow old, but as my father says, it beats the alternative. Next slide. So what is healthy aging? How can we live a more fulfilled life? And one of the things I really thought was such a poignant statement that one of the nurse practitioners I work with who focuses on palliative care and hospice, when she's talking to our older patients or families with older family members, she asked them, do they have joy in their life? And I think it's such a very simple question for all of us to ask. You know, it's interesting. I've done a lot of really wonderful things in my career that if you asked my young self what my career would look like, I always was striving for the next opportunity and really excited about what more could I do. And I think that it's safe to say that when you start to enter your fifth decade, you kind of look back and realize that you're closer to retirement than you are to the beginning of your career. And I see so many of my colleagues striving, getting up earlier, going to meetings early in the morning, late at night, skipping exercise, stress eating because they're so sleep deprived. And I see them putting on weight and developing the medical conditions that we all know are so unhealthy for us, like high blood pressure and diabetes. And, you know, essentially one of the messages to living longer or living healthier is really deciding what you want your life to look like and what you're willing to do or what changes you're willing to make in your life to live a healthier life. And I would advocate that all of us stop and try to today say, what would your perfect script look like for your life if you could write it? Next slide. So this book called Outlive, the physician talks about the history of medicine. He talks about medicine 1.0 being survival. And that means not getting eaten by alligators or sharks or falling out of a car or not wearing a helmet. So really, if you think about probably the mortality rate of car accidents in the 1920s, when cars were invented and there was no such thing as seatbelts, and even just surviving, not having healthy food, not having refrigeration. So really, the beginning of medicine was just surviving life. Medicine 2.0, he talks about the invention of antibiotics and the invention of medications to treat diabetes, basic conditions that have really changed the trajectory of, more than anything else, infection, diabetes, high blood pressure. And then medicine 3.0, really the message of the book is, and the message that I wanted to share tonight is really incredibly, if you take the incidence of people dying young from infection out of the mortality curves and you re-evaluate the mortality curves, our survival rate has not changed significantly since the 1930s. And so, as much as we have learned how to treat cancer and we keep coming up with more and more treatments for illnesses, our society has stopped being as adaptable to living a healthy life. So as infection has become less of a problem, now we're seeing more and more problems with excess calories, with diabetes, with heart disease, and problems that people didn't survive long enough to have those problems previously. So that's really the theme: is what can we do to change this season of our lives? Next slide. So this is really an interesting pictorial of kind of the history of medicine. And this is part of what Dr. Attia in that book describes as medicine 2.0, technology and scientific advances that have improved mortality. So in green were the advances in infection. In the 1865, the risk of dying of childbirth was upwards of 25%. Apparently, at some of the most prominent obstetric hospitals, the physicians would perform autopsies or do surgeries or treat patients, not wash their hands, and then go deliver babies. And in 1865, when they realized that washing your hands would reduce the infection rate for obstetric patients, we noticed a significant decline in mortality rate of pregnant women. In 1930s, there was the invention of antibiotics, and we started to see a reduction in people of dying pneumonia and simple infections. In the 1980s, HIV became the prominent infection concern in our society, but by the end of the decade, we had treatment for it. And by the end of the 1990s, we had treatment not only for HIV, but we started to see treatments for hepatitis C. And in 1998, hepatitis C became a absolutely treatable disease. It's incredible. I graduated medical school in 1995, and I was being trained by one of the leading hepatitis C physicians, experts in the country. And we were doing liver transplants exhaustively on patients with hepatitis C who had liver failure. In 2001, only 1% of patients who received a liver transplant had a transplant related to fatty liver, but 20% due to hepatitis C. In 2013, 1 in 3 patients were cured of hepatitis C by the invention of infection treatments. And now in 2018, 20% of liver transplants are being done for fatty liver. So while modern medicine has improved our longevity with antibiotics, we're finding that lifestyle changes late in the 20th century and now in the 21st century of an increasingly sedentary population is really causing different life problems and different risks of mortality. Next slide. The same goes for diabetes. In the 1700s, diabetes was absolutely rare because people didn't have excess food available. In the 1950s, 1 in 300 Americans had diabetes. By 1970, that statistic was 1 in 50 Americans. In 2023, 19 out of 50 adults, or 38% of adults in America, have prediabetes or diabetes, and 30% of patients over the age of 65 are diabetic. Next slide. So we're trading some problems for other problems. This is really the theme of the book and the theme of this talk. I wanted to divide the talk into preventing illness and prolonging a healthy life as we age. And really the second part of this talk will be about when prevention is no longer a possibility. So Dr. Attia talks about the 4 horsemen, that 80% of adults in America die of one of 4 conditions: atherosclerosis, cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, and diabetes and its sequelae. Next slide. But I want to pause and remind the audience that my message is one of moderation. Not every thin person is healthy. Not every heavy person is unhealthy. Alcohol is not terrible. It actually may reduce your risk of heart disease if you drink 1 glass of red wine once every other night, once a night, is considered actually healthy for you. We need sugar in our diet for quick energy. And all calories are derived from protein, fat, and carbohydrates. So if we're telling you cut out protein, cut out fat, cut out carbohydrates, well, then we would be trying to exist on water alone. All of these foods and nutrients are needed in our diet. It really is a matter of deciding what we want our life to look like, how active and how healthy we want to feel, how functional we want our life to be, and what we're willing to do to prolong the good years, the joy in our life. Next slide. So the 4 horsemen, they can all be attributed to diet and exercise and to genetics. So what's really interesting is modern science, and this is really in the last 5 to 10 years, has started to talk about what our genetic factors are to develop these conditions and what we can do to challenge our genetics and to improve our quality of life and our quantity. So atherosclerosis is really referring to both heart disease and stroke. Cancer is referring cancer diagnoses. Certainly we have families who have an increased risk of cancer by history, but what we find is patients who are overweight and less active actually have more cancer. There are many examples of that. Certainly overweight women have a higher circulating estrogen, even, and when you're overweight and the overweight condition causes an increased conversion of estrogen in our circulation, that can actually increase your risk of female-related cancers. And patients who have a diet that is rich in carbohydrates and simple sugars often will have slower transit of their colon, which can increase your risk of colon cancer. So certainly what we understand is the inactive condition, the stressed lifestyle, and being overweight are all separate risk factors for cancer. As far as neurodegenerative disease, Alzheimer's has been linked to the development of plaques in the brain. And these plaques are often related to lipids. There are specific lipids, ApoE4, which is a lipid that can be measured, and 12% of the population has 1 copy of that gene, 2 to 3% has 2. The incidence of developing Alzheimer's, if you carry 2 copies of that gene, is very high. But again, these genes are expressing a lipid, which is cholesterol. And so by reducing the amount of cholesterol in your diet, then you can reduce your risk of Alzheimer's. Vascular dementia is related to both high blood pressure and to cholesterol, causing what we call small vessel ischemia, which just means lack of oxygen supply to the tiny vessels in your brain, which can slowly damage your brain over time. Diabetes is certainly related to excess carbohydrates and to lipid metabolism. Diabetes is also related to, so anyone with diabetes who has excess calories and excess lipids increases their risk of dementia, of neurodegenerative diseases, of cancer, and of atherosclerosis. So it really links to all of them. Next slide, please. So the root causes of these 4 horsemen, as far as what we can control and what we can modify. For atherosclerosis, it's certainly diet, exercise, blood pressure control, and cholesterol. For cancer, it's being overweight or less active. For neurodegenerative diseases, such as dementia, again, it's control of your cholesterol and your lipids, as well as your high blood pressure. And for diabetes, it's control of the weight and of the lipids. Next slide. Another interesting phenomenon is called the metabolic syndrome. That is defined as a pre-diabetic or a diabetic condition, which again can lead to all of the horsemen. Specifically, men with a waistline that is greater than 40 inches and women with greater than 35 inches, which is measured across the belly. So central obesity, elevated blood pressure, or anyone who has hypertension and is taking blood pressure medications, elevated triglycerides, which are considered bad cholesterol, elevated fasting blood glucose, or being diabetic, and a low good cholesterol, which is called the high density lipoprotein, less than 40 for men and less than 50 for women. Next slide. So it's not all about weight and the scale. I often applaud my older patients when we start talking about osteoporosis. Ironically, the very thin patients who don't have much weight on are a much higher risk of osteoporosis. And breaking bones can seriously interfere with one's mobility and quality of life. And so I tease them that by having a little weight on their bones, they're doing weight-based exercises just by staying healthy. And so I don't want this message to be everyone needs to go on a diet. That is certainly not at all. It really is much more important to understand what your personal risks are and what your opportunities are to change your trajectory. The other thing I talk about is the concept of prime the pump. So atherosclerosis is cholesterol buildup on the inside of your arteries. And so if you get your heart rate up and your blood is pumping faster around your circulatory system, you're keeping your pipes clean. I tell people it's kind of like a kitchen sink. I don't know about you, but I have been known to keep putting the water on in my kitchen sink, even if it slows down. As long as the water keeps pumping through the pipe, I'm not worried about it. It's when the water doesn't go through that we all worry. Well, that analogy can be really compared to our vessels. If we have sluggish circulation because we're not getting our heart rate up and exercising and we're sedentary, then those cholesterol plaques can build up in the inside of our arteries. And so people who are at their ideal body weight or even over their ideal body weight, but are really intentional about getting out and walking and getting their heart rate up, have a much better chance of staving off the 4 horsemen. Next slide. So this is the part that I thought was most interesting. I'm going to go back to my description of being somebody in the workforce who is around a lot of people who work very hard. It's really kind of crazy. We used to start meetings at work at 8 o'clock. And then we realized that we're busy seeing patients at 8 o'clock, so we'll start meetings at 7 o'clock. And then we realized, well, we want to see patients early because it seems that the longer you stay, the longer you stay. So we don't want to have meetings at 7 o'clock. We want to get started seeing patients at 7 o'clock. So we started having meetings at 6:30. Well, Jacksonville is a big place. And if you want to have a meeting at 6:30, that means that people are getting up to get ready for work at 5:30. There's no time to exercise or to take care of yourself. And then that same analogy, as we push harder to work harder and do more, then we're not sleeping well. And what's really fascinating about the physiology is we're learning that it's not only what you put in your body, but it's really how you treat your body that significantly impacts the likelihood of you developing the 4 horsemen. You know, one of the things that's so amusing and interesting to me about longevity is we all can probably describe a friend or a family member or somebody in our community. Well, that fella had a beer every night and he lived to 101, where that lady smoked cigarettes all the way up to her 95th birthday. And the answer is that's true. So how can we predict and influence our own genetics and our own longevity, but more importantly, our own joy, a high quality, fulfilling life? We really have to look at what our family history is and understand that maybe somebody who has a beverage every night is getting out and exercising, or maybe they're just not as stressed out and they're sleeping more. So it really is an extraordinary and complex conversation of how we all can impact our lives. But I would argue that the physicians I described who were my mentors when I joined Baptist 20 years ago, who are in their 50s, some of them are living their best life now in retirement, and some of them worked every single day up until the day that they passed away. And I would say that if you're living a life where you're working 12 or 14 hours days and you never find the time to sleep more or to de-stress or to exercise, then you're more likely to turn on oncogenes or turn on genes that increase the bad chemistries in your cells that are going to lead to dementia or lead to atherosclerosis. And the book that I described that was just published this year by this physician, Dr. Attia, really talks about the groundbreaking science that is teaching us that it's not just about food. It's not just about cholesterol. It's not about weight and exercise. It's also about stress and how we treat our bodies. And you could use the same analogy for both tobacco and alcohol, certainly. You know, it's interesting. So I've been a practicing physician for 27 years, and I have encountered hundreds, if not thousands of patients who say, well, I only smoked for a couple years, or I drink more than I should, but I know my limit. Do you know the youngest patient that I ever had in hospice for alcoholism was 26 years old, and the youngest patient to die of lung cancer, 27. And those stories are certainly they're jarring, but it really does speak to the idea that it's genetics, it's the volume of excess that we might embark on at certain points in our life, and then it's just how we treat our bodies in general. So I need to at least emphasize, you know, in the last 5 years, we've seen a lot more illness related to marijuana as well. So nobody gets a get out of jail free card. All of these substances, including excess food, can really impact the quality of our life and the quantity, but it's not the whole picture. Next slide. So what can each one of you do to impact your life, impact your family's life if you're the one grocery shopping or setting the schedule, and your community? Diet, diet, diet. Not low calorie, but what you put in your body matters. The more we can eat healthy, lean proteins, really have a modest red meat and processed meat diet, have more vegetables, lower saturated fats, and moderate carbohydrates. Not zero, but moderate. Excess carbohydrates are stored as fat. Move more, increase your exercise. I'm not talking about Jane Fonda and aerobic workouts with headbands. Everyone doesn't need to run a marathon at 50, just walking. I've really encouraged my patients in my community for people to park at the end of the parking lot when you go to the grocery store. Don't try to find the one real close by. Go all the way to the end of the parking lot. It's better for your car. You're less likely to get your door dinged. And it just forces you to walk more. If you work in a building that has several stories, walk up the stairs. If you feel too winded when you walk up the stairs, take the elevator up and then walk down the stairs. If you have access to swimming, it's a wonderful exercise that doesn't put stress on your joints. Biking, or anything that keeps you moving. I can't stress enough how important it is to reduce stress. Find me time. It could just be 10 minutes. It could be that you get up 10 minutes earlier every morning and just look out the window, have a cup of coffee or tea, or even a glass of water, and just take a few minutes before you jump up and start speeding off to taking care of the rest of the world and everybody else's problems. Sleep more and add joy. Curb bad habits. That certainly will benefit you to reduce your alcohol, stop smoking or reduce smoking, stop stress eating, and be mindful of how much sugar you're eating in your diet. And also, if you're nearing retirement or if you're in retirement, stay engaged. We know that no matter what your diagnosis or condition, whether you're in a wheelchair, whether or not you have memory impairment, whether or not you're sharp as a tack, doing something to engage your mind and finding purpose is as important as all the other recommendations. I always ask my patients, do crossword puzzles, Sudoku, join a book club, volunteer. It really almost doesn't matter, but do something. Next slide. Next, I wanted to shift to the concept of when prevention is not the conversation. So much of what we do when we talk about aging well is taking care of people when they have cognitive function, problems with their physical function, or even difficulties with depression or loneliness. You know, one of the things that is so apparent is if we had a retrospectoscope and we could look back at our life, wouldn't it be wonderful if we knew how much time we had and we could be more intentional? What we do understand is, by and large, people who have not taken care of their bodies or are just plagued with conditions, whether it's genetics or just, you know, factors that we don't well understand yet with modern science, the last 10 years of most patients' lives are the hardest. And so finding ways to maintain your cognitive function, finding ways to reduce your risk of losing your mobility, and also finding ways to connect are as important as all the other things that we've discussed. Next slide. So when we're not talking about prevention, when patients have chronic disease, we really like to change the conversation. We talk about the 5 M's. This is from the Institute of Health. Managing chronic disease, understanding challenges with mobility, managing medications and avoiding polypharmacy, which is defined as too many medications, understanding what factors interfere with a person's mentation or cognitive difficulties, and most importantly, what matters. You know, modern medicine has given us the ability to treat so many different diseases. A day doesn't go by that I don't hear about a new therapy, a new treatment on the horizon for advanced cancer, or a new treatment on the horizon for many conditions. We have a lot of new therapies that are coming out for Alzheimer's, but does it really matter? And are we improving somebody's quality of life? This is a quote from Thomas More from 1516. It's an essay he wrote called The Utopians. I thought it was so poignant. And it was so amazing that this quote came from so many years ago. They talk about looking after the sick so that nothing is left undone, which may contribute either to their health or ease. And for those who are afflicted with an incurable disorder, may we use all possible means of cherishing them, of making their lives comfortable, visiting them often, taking great pains to make their time pass easily. And that's really a different way of saying what matters in our lives when we're facing the last season of our life, or as defined by Dr. Attia, usually the last 10 years. Next slide. So I spent quite a bit of time talking about our transition as a society from medicine 2.0, which was discovering treatments for common illnesses and treating conditions, versus medicine 3.0, which is how do you take personal inventory of your risks of health problems and can you change your trajectory? Next slide. Again, I felt this was so important that I wanted to reiterate. For those of you who are wanting to focus on healthy living and aging well, these are the important features that you need to consider: your diet, your activity level, reducing stress, curbing bad habits, and staying engaged in your community. That's really about prevention. Next slide. When prevention is not the focus and patients have chronic illness, I want you to think about how we manage chronic disease, whether or not more medications are causing more side effects or causing more complications. Mobility. It's not just about getting up and walking. It's about understanding that if a patient has a fall risk and engages in activities that increase their risk of falling, hip fractures, compression fractures of the spine, these are conditions that ruin a patient's life. And everything we can do to increase or maintain mobility really improves their longevity. There's a statistic that we often quote that 25% of seniors who have a hip fracture pass away within 2 years of their hip fracture. It's not the hip fracture per se, but it's the recovery from surgery, it's anesthesia, it's all the things that go along with the hip fracture and why they fell and fractured the hip that causes these problems. And so avoiding hip fractures is something really important. You know, I spent 27 years focusing most of my attention on the care of patients in the hospital. And every December, every single time I was on call, which was about once a week, I would admit a patient to the hospital with a hip fracture who had climbed up on a ladder to hang ornaments on their Christmas tree or hang Christmas lights and had fallen off of a ladder. So as much as none of us want to admit or accept the fact that what we did in our 20s should not be what we're doing in our 80s, it really behooves patients to be more wise and more cognizant of what their risks are of having more complications and creating more problems for themselves. I had a very lovely fellow who was trying to replant a tree in his garden, and he pushed too hard on the shovel, fell backwards and cracked a bone in his back. And really, you know, it seemed harmless. He seemed very active and very mobile, but we really do need, especially in our 8th decade of life, to look at what activities you're engaging in and what is the risk of falling or having a complication. Mentation is also important. Understanding whether or not a patient who has severe cognitive impairment, which we call dementia, whether or not they should undergo a surgery, or whether or not the risk of worsening their cognitive function from anesthesia might ruin whatever quality of life they have. And most importantly, what matters? What matters in their quality of life? Next slide. This is a really interesting study, and this is part of what we're focusing on at AgeWell and the senior strategy right now. I'm sorry, this slide is not very easy to read, but I'll point you to the bottom right corner of 22%. There's a very simple frailty score that we can do. It's a survey that takes 2 minutes. And what we found is patients who are not frail have only a 1.89 or 2% risk of dying after elective surgery in 30 days. If they're frail, their risk of dying after an elective surgery is 7%. If they're considered very frail, their risk of dying is almost 25%. So this is not for emergency surgery because you have a terrible symptom. This is an elective surgery that somebody chooses to do. So we would like to make sure that when we're asking a patient, would you like us to try to do a back surgery because you have chronic back pain and this might improve your quality of life? If that patient's very frail, we need to include in the conversation, but your risk of having a terrible outcome might be as high as 1 in 4. So we're looking at different ways to consent patients. The other conversation that we often have with patients, especially in their 8th and 9th decade of life, if you have cancer and if there's a novel treatment that might improve your quality of life or might not improve your quality of life, but might extend it for 2 or 3 months, do you really want to undergo the risks or the side effects? And that's really goes back to the conversation of what matters. Next slide. This is something that I'm very proud of. And this is really kind of the overarching theme of what Baptist Health is focusing on and what we call the senior strategy. We're looking at all of the things that I just talked about: depression and loneliness and cognitive disorders and how that impacts our seniors. We're looking at how targeted therapy, whether or not it's counseling or whether or not it's balance and physical therapy, can improve an older patient's quality of life. We have a new program called Management of Serious Illness and Advocacy, where if a patient over the age of 65 with more than one medical condition ends up in the hospital, are we doing everything possible to make sure that when they are discharged from the hospital, they don't end up returning to the hospital based on not having as coordinated care as we could? We're looking at all of our seniors, their pharmacy profile, and trying to really be intentional about what medications can benefit the patients and what medications might cause more side effects or drug interactions. We're creating more robust home support models so that when a patient is discharged from the hospital and go home, our home health nurses have more tools to make sure that the patients get all the care that they need and don't end up back in the hospital. There is many statistics that have been quoted, but it's the mantra is that the vast majority of Americans spend upwards of 20% of all of their healthcare dollars in their entire lifetime in the last 6 months of their life, but don't improve their quality of life. So is it beneficial for patients to be admitted to the hospital, or are we doing everything we can to keep them out of the hospital? And lastly, part of our senior strategy is our AgeWell senior living clinics and our house calls program, which cares for patients who are homebound in the community, so that we can be very focused on taking care of our seniors and the unique needs that they have in primary care. Next slide. So when I talk about what matters, one of the things that we want people to know is sometimes less intensive medical care is more, much more. I recently had the absolute joy and privilege of meeting a 93-year-old patient who was recommended to go undergo a salvage therapy for her leaky heart valve. And the cardiologist gave the patient very clear instructions about what are their risks and what are their benefits. And they were very open and upfront about the fact that, well, you could not have a good outcome and you could possibly die from having to have this procedure that might improve your quality of life. After having a very meaningful and extensive conversation with both her primary care and her family and the cardiologist, that patient said, I don't want the procedure. I'd rather live with my leaky heart valve. So she entered hospice. Do you know that after 2 years, she was doing so well that she graduated from hospice and now has returned to becoming an AgeWell patient in my practice? The message is, what we now understand is, while you can do everything to take care of a patient, sometimes we have to be more intentional about giving informed consent about what are the risks of a procedure. So what I would advocate for everyone, including present company, as we look towards entering the senior population, if you're not already there, is that you establish care with a physician and a team that you trust. Be open to honest conversations about what quality of life looks like. Plan your care. It really is humbling to me when I have a patient who is heavily smoking in their 60s or 70s, and they say, well, I don't think I'm going to develop lung disease because I haven't developed it yet. They may be right, but more likely than not, they're limiting their quality of life and the quantity of life by their choices. And that's okay. I just want to make sure every patient has the opportunity to be well informed and they understand the risks and benefits of all of the lifestyle choices that they're making. Lastly, every patient should establish the goals of care. I'll go back to my father. He's lived a wonderful life. And while we don't talk about it in a moribund fashion, we understand that at 95 and a half years old, as he says, he's lived more years behind him than he has in front of him. And so I say, Dad, what is it that you want? And he says, I want to play my saxophone. He's had the joy of working with Dizzy Gillespie, with Lawrence Welk, with more stars than I could care to describe. And that's his greatest joy. And that's what I tell every patient. What is your joy? And so my dad said, if I have a stroke, if I can't play my saxophone, if one side of my body is not functioning, please don't put a feeding tube in me. So every goal of care conversation isn't, do we put you on the respirator? Do we not put you on the respirator? But truly, I don't know that the community understands when we talk about surviving CPR, that's really talking about the 25-year-old who got hit with a football in the chest and their heart stopped, or the 50-year-old that had a heart attack. What we understand is that the lack of oxygen supply to the brain, if somebody has a natural death and they have more than 80 birthdays, the likelihood of them returning to the same cognitive level of functioning becomes zero. So close to zero, we'll say zero. That statistic diminishes even more when we talk about people in their 90s. So I have patients who come to me and they say, what should I do? If my family member's dementia gets worse, I think I should make them a do not resuscitate in the event of a natural death. Usually the conversation has a different trajectory after we talk about the fact that their quality of life is so poor with severe impairment of cognition now that the likelihood of any meaningful quality of life, if they were to lose more oxygen to the brain, would be very, very low. But those conversations are so tough to have at the very end of someone's life. And so I strongly encourage every patient and every family to have those conversations many years before we have to, and establish goals of care. Next slide. It has been my pleasure to share with you the thoughts and the themes of Dr. Attia's book, Outlive, the idea of living a more quality life and hopefully a longer life and aging in a healthy manner. I welcome any questions.
Wow, I almost want to give you a round of applause. That was amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Bartfield, for sharing such an informative and full presentation with us. I am going to stop sharing my screen because I want to be able to get to any questions that may have been shared on the chat. Let's see here. And if not, I have some questions that were submitted earlier. When we talk about the subject of aging and older adults, a common topic of a discussion is medications, and so that's primarily what these particular questions are surrounded by. So let's see here. So are there any treatments or medications that can stifle the body's ability to absorb vitamins and other nutrients that the body needs?
No, I would say, so there's an weight loss medication that has been out on the market probably 15, maybe 20 years, called Orlistat. And that medication blocks the absorption of fat from the food you eat. It also blocks the absorption for vitamins. So that condition certainly, or that medication certainly comes to mind. Interestingly, many people, again, in their 7th to 8th decade of life, maybe as many as 20% of patients start to lose the efficiency of absorbing vitamin B12 in their diet. And so they can insidiously become vitamin B12 deficient. And that's something that's easily treatable and can improve or maintain brain function and also reduce your risk of having neurologic complications that can be very serious. So that's something that we look for.
Sure. Thank you so much for that. And then just to piggyback off that question, I know that some of the seniors that I serve, they talk about some of their family members that they care for are involved in treatments such as chemotherapy, those types of, medical treatments that may have some effects as well, with their bodies not being able to absorb as much nutrients as it needs. So I'm sure that, with being under the care of a doctor, those are things that they kind of work through with their nutritionists, dietitians, things like that.
We certainly emphasize maintaining calorie intake when patients start to lose weight. That's a really important thing. And that's really one of the things that we do with Age Well Clinic is we often have, again, the rehabilitative services include dietitians that can help patients make sure as we age, it's not uncommon for patients to lose their appetite, especially with
That's
cancer
my next
diagnoses
question. Yeah.
and also with cognitive impairment. Patients who have dementia are less likely to be interested in food. And so I
Mhm.
always tell people that you need to have more bang for your buck.
Mm.
If that means that if you only want a half a piece of toast, well, putting a little bit of avocado on it, peanut butter or butter to increase the caloric intake in a smaller volume is often a very good strategy.
Yeah, that was actually my next question. You went right into it. It's often said that it's common that the older that you get, your appetite, also decreases. And uh, if so, which it does, which we just found out, when should it be a matter of concern, for the caregiver?
Oh, I would say that anytime there's more than a few pounds lost. So let's use the analogy of, or the example of a 200-pound patient. So
Mhm.
5% body loss would be 10 pounds. Certainly at 5% of any weight, that should raise a flag.
Mm.
But the reality is, our population is becoming um, more sedentary. And so more people we have a higher body mass index as a nation. And
Mhm.
so the fact that we find it very easy to maintain weight, right? Um, if somebody's losing weight, that's a red flag. So I would strongly encourage anybody who's losing weight to make an appointment with your doctor and get some simple tests done.
That's a great point. Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Now, there's also been talk on both sides about the topic of multivitamins, whether older adults should or should not take them. Can you kind of share your perspective on that? I know there's been a lot of conversation on, those types of vitamins and nutrients need to be gotten through food rather than pills.
Right.
So,
So I don't prescribe a lot of vitamins. A lot of our recommendations come from the United States Task Force, which looks at really big scientific studies and says what is best for a population. The fact that we have a healthy population who maintains their body weight well means we're probably getting enough nutrients. With that said, anyone who has a restrictive diet, anyone who has a significant medical condition that interferes with their ability to absorb food, such as celiac disease, vitamin B12 deficiency, or restrictive from, just personal choice. Certainly vegetarian lifestyle, it is a healthy lifestyle with a really strong pause.
mhm.
I have many friends who are vegetarian. Certainly, we have a lot of um, people who were from India or Hindu in our community, where that is absolutely the lifestyle. And so it's not only just cultural, but it's also of religious reasons. And it's interesting. I have several friends who are strong vegetarians, and one of the physicians who I think about and interact with regularly, he tells me that 50% um, of his family members are diabetic before age 50.
Oh,
Because if they're counting on all of their calories to be carbohydrate, the body can't manufacture enough insulin. I tell people it's kind of like if your pancreas is an engine. If you have a motorcycle, you need a small engine to fuel it. If you have a Winnebago, you need a bigger engine. So I consider the Winnebago of a carbohydrate-rich diet. So no protein. So all your calories coming from carbohydrates, you wear out your pancreas. And so, and you also miss out on some nutrients. And so I would certainly say anybody who chooses to be vegetarian, there are protein sources that are not meats, peanut butter, beans, but you're at higher risk if you're restricting your diet and don't have a broad variety. You're at higher risk of vitamin deficiencies. And so that's something to discuss with your physician and consider a multivitamin. But the average American diet, if you're not restricting your diet and you don't have an absorption problem, we don't need multivitamins.
Thank you so much for that. I'm sure that answers many questions out there. And we are far into our time, but there is one particular attendee that I wanted to make sure that we got in. For those who are still with us, thank you so much for hanging in there with us. If you could just give us maybe just like 2 more minutes, just so we can make sure that we attend to Mr. Mario Chapman. So Mr. Chapman, I am going to allow you to talk. If you can unmute yourself, if you want to ask Dr. Barfield your question.
Yes, I did.
Okay.
I want to know if the presentation would be available following this.
Oh, yes, it will definitely be available. We usually send it to our marketing department just to edit. And then I send it out to all the registrants once we get the recording edited. Yeah, so it will definitely be made available to all of the registrants.
It's a great presentation, and one of the concerns has been, is quality of life more important, or is taking the risk in using medication more important?
I agree. I paused when I was putting together this presentation. I had a great moment of pause as to whether or not to include my personal story of my father in the presentation, but it's so important. I took care of my mother and my stepmother through cancer care, and lost both of them. And it's humbling to have taken care of thousands of patients in my career, but really it's coming home even more so now when I have the privilege of taking care of my very active and cognitively intact father, and to help him lead a better, higher quality life, but doesn't necessarily mean more medications or more procedures.
That is so good. I learned so much, here, just even for me and my family. So, the saying goes, when you know better, you do better. And so, your presentation has just really added to my arsenal of knowledge, just for myself and my family. So I'm sure I speak for a lot of all of these participants here. This was such an amazing presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Barfield. So we are going to now get out of here. I'm going to get you out of here really quickly. Just share some brief closing announcements. So as always, we provide an electronic takeaway information that will be emailed to you tomorrow. We also provide a survey. This was, again, one of the topics that our audience did want to have a presentation on, which is healthy aging, which is why we were able to, ask Dr. Barfield to be here with us today. So please, we ask that you please participate in that survey, just to help us, gear our offerings to you. Next month, we have Coping with Grief, Life Beyond Loss. That is our next session. September is Mental Health Awareness Month. And so as we go into the holidays, we definitely want to have a discussion around grief. So please join us next month. That registration will be available to you tomorrow as well. And then we just want to have you to save the date. Our final session for the 2023 Health Education Series will be on October 17th, where we will be covering cancer awareness and prevention. And we will actually be discussing breast, lung, colon, and prostate cancer. So you want to make sure you save the date and look out for that registration link as well. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you so much for the extra couple of minutes that you gave us on this evening. And that ends tonight's session. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bartfield.